You leave a note on the kitchen table. You send a message and watch the little read receipt appear. Writing, you assume, is for someone to read. But the true origin of the characters on your screen is far stranger. The first Chinese writing was a message to the dead. It was carved into bone, and then it was buried immediately. No living person was supposed to see it. Why would anyone do that? The answer begins with fear. It begins in a world where the dead still ruled the living. In 1899, a Chinese scholar named Wang Yirong was sick with malaria. He went to an apothecary in Beijing. He bought the traditional medicine called dragon bones. These were usually fragments of ancient bone and shell, ground up to treat ailments. But when Wang Yirong examined his purchase, he noticed something strange. The bone fragments were covered in tiny, intricate carvings. He recognized them as an ancient form of writing. No one had seen these symbols in thousands of years. He had stumbled upon the earliest known Chinese script. Soon, other scholars joined the search. The bones were traced back to a site near Anyang. There, excavations revealed a lost city. It was Yinxu, the last capital of the Shang Dynasty. The Shang ruled China over 3,000 years ago. Until that moment, almost nothing was known about them. These bones were the lost voice of a forgotten era. Thousands of inscribed bones and turtle shells were uncovered. Over 150,000 fragments have been found to date. They form the largest corpus of early Chinese writing. These were oracle bones. They turned out to be a royal archive of terror and devotion. The Shang kings used them to communicate with their ancestors. For the Shang, the dead were not truly gone. They lived on in a spirit world, and they had immense power over the living. Crops could fail. Battles could be lost. Illness could strike without warning. The king believed his ancestors controlled these outcomes. A bad harvest meant starvation. A lost battle meant annihilation. A royal illness could destabilize the entire kingdom. The stakes were terrifying. The king's fears were your fears. Health, survival, safety. But he had no weather app, no emergency services. The only help came from the dead. Could you trust a god you couldn't see? So, to manage the uncertainty, the king turned to divination. The process was elaborate. First, a turtle plastron or an ox shoulder bone was prepared. It was cleaned and polished. Then, small oval pits were carved into the back. The king or a diviner would speak a question. Then the question was carved onto the front of the bone. The carving was a form of writing addressed directly to the dead. The questions reveal a world saturated with anxiety. What would you ask if you knew only the dead could answer? Will the harvest be abundant? Is the ancestor pleased with our offerings? Will the enemy attack tomorrow? Why is the king's tooth causing him pain? In one bone, King Wu Ding asked if his wife Fu Hao's military campaign would succeed. In another, he asked whether a dream about a black cloud was an omen. The questions were deeply personal and urgent. Every event was suspected of being a signal from the ancestors. After the question was carved, a red-hot bronze rod was applied to the pits. The heat caused cracks on the front of the bone. The cracks were interpreted as the ancestor's answer. The diviner would read the pattern of the fractures. Sometimes the answer was also carved onto the bone. A typical record reads, "On Geysi Day, the king divined, will there be disaster in the coming 10 days? The king read the cracks and said, there will be harm." It was a direct conversation with the dead, but only one side could speak. The ancestor's voice was in the cracking. The king's voice was in the carving. Once the ritual was complete, the bone was buried in a pit or stored away. The message was meant to remain hidden. The living were not supposed to read it again. In a sense, the real audience was always invisible. The writing was a performance for an unseen spectator. Burying it sealed the communication. This was not writing as a tool for memory. It was a sacred technology for managing fear. Can you imagine writing something you know no human will ever see? A historian named David Keatley spent decades studying these texts. He mapped the king's concerns, their negotiations with the invisible. Keatley found that the Shang kings often returned to the same question multiple times. They would refine the wording as if anxious to get the right answer. One famous bone records over 30 separate divinations about a single sacrifice. The dead had to be constantly consulted, cajoled, and fed. Can you feel the desperation in that? The writing was beautiful, but its purpose was desperate. The script itself was pictographic. The symbol for sun looked like a sun. A symbol for tree looked like a tree. The symbol for river was 3 wavy lines. But these were not simple drawings. They were a highly developed system with grammar and syntax. Over 4,000 distinct characters have been identified. About a quarter have been deciphered. The rest remain a mystery. Another scholar, Li Feng, described the Shang state as a theocracy. The king was the high priest. His power rested on his exclusive ability to talk to the dead. So the writing was not a public technology, it was a royal secret. The ability to carve these messages was confined to a small circle of scribes. Ordinary people probably never saw these characters. Imagine a world where reading and writing were magic. Where to carve a word was to cast a spell. Writing was a tool of fear and control. It linked the king to the cosmic order. Here is the twist. But why bury the message? Why not preserve it for the living? The first Chinese writing was never meant for the living, but it eventually became the script of an entire civilization. The characters you see today on signs, on menus, on your phone, they descend from those buried bone messages. The shape for person still looks like a person in modern Chinese. The shape for rain still echoes the ancient scratches. Imagine that. The most everyday marks you encounter started as a terrified whisper to a ghost, and the fear did not disappear. For centuries, Chinese writing retained a sacred power. People burned prayers written on paper, believing the words would ascend to heaven in the smoke. The dead could still read. In fact, for years before Wang Yirong's discovery, farmers had been digging up these bones. They sold them to apothecaries as dragon bone. For centuries, people were ingesting the oldest written messages. The words meant for the dead were being consumed by the living. It was a bizarre reversal of the original ritual. If no one had gotten sick and bought those bones, the writing might have remained unknown. The earliest chapter of one of the world's great scripts was almost erased by stomachs. What if no one had noticed? So next time you write something down, think about what you were really doing. You were scratching symbols onto a surface. You assume they will be seen by someone else. But writing still carries that ancient DNA. It is a technology for sending words across time. When you write a note, you are speaking to a future version of someone. When you post online, you are hurling your voice into a void, hoping someone invisible is listening. The Shang king carved into bone for an absent reader. You type into a screen for an absent reader. The audience is different. The impulse is remarkably similar. The shape of your letters, whether English, or Chinese, has a ghost in it. The very act of writing is built on a foundation of fear and the supernatural. You pick up your phone now. You tap out a message. You wait for it to be read. But the first message you ever wrote was carved on bone. It was buried in the earth. And it was addressed only to the dead. So the next time you leave a note on the kitchen table, pause for a moment. The writing you use every day has a ghostly lineage. The first writing was not a note for a friend. It was a plea scratched on bone. It was placed in the ground. It was meant only for the dead. And it was never supposed to reach your eyes. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our channel. A new story every week.